The Wych Elm Mystery by David Eden. Chapter 1. The Boys from Hagley. Tommy Willits had seen dead things before. Rabbits caught in snares, birds fallen from nests, even Mrs. Hartley's tabby after it met the wrong end of a lorry on Birmingham Road. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what grinned at him from inside the wych elm that April morning in 1943. It started innocently enough. 4 lads from Hagley Wood, out for a spot of birds, nesting despite the war and rationing and all the grown-up worries that tried to squeeze the childhood out of them. Tommy, at 14, was the eldest. Then came Bob Farmer and Fred Payne, both 13, and little Harry Hart, who just turned 11 but swore blind he was 12. The morning mist still clung to Hagley Wood like a guilty secret. The trees stood silent, their branches reaching up like arthritic fingers. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the drone of a Spitfire, or was it a Messerschmitt? These days, you could never be entirely sure. "Over here," Bob called out, pointing to a massive wych elm that stood apart from its brothers like a parish outcast. The tree was ancient, its trunk thick and gnarled, split near the base where rot had eaten away at its heart. Tommy approached first, drawn by that peculiar magnetism that pulls boys toward dark spaces and hidden things. The hollow in the trunk yawned before him, black as a coal miner's lungs. He peered inside, expecting to find nothing more exciting than old leaves and beetle shells. Instead, he found her. At first, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. It looked like a bird's nest, he told himself. A big one. Made of? No, that wasn't right. Birds didn't use hair like that, all matted and clinging to something pale and round and— Christ almighty, Tommy whispered, stumbling backward so fast he nearly knocked Harry over. What is it? Fred pushed forward, eager for a look. What you find? Tommy grabbed Fred's collar, yanking him back. His voice came out strangled, barely his own. Don't look. Don't any of you look. But of course they did. Boys always do. The skull grinned up at them from its prison of wood and shadow, still wearing tatters of flesh and wisps of hair. The body, what remained of it, had been stuffed into the hollow like a rag doll shoved into a toy chest. One skeletal hand reached up through the cavity as if trying to claw its way back to the world of the living. Harry was sick immediately, his breakfast porridge spattering the forest floor. Bob just stood there, white as January snow, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Fred, to his credit, managed to speak. Is she? Dead, Tommy said, though it was obvious. Had been obvious from the moment he'd seen that terrible grin. Long dead. They should have run then. Should have pelted back through Hagley Wood to the village, to the constable, to any adult who could take this horror off their young shoulders. But something held them there. The same dark fascination that makes people slow down at accident scenes, that makes them read the gruesome bits in newspapers twice. Look, Bob whispered, pointing with a trembling finger. There's something in her mouth. And there was. Stuffed between those yellowed teeth, wadded tight as a cork in a bottle, was what looked like taffeta. Cream-colored, Tommy thought, though it was hard to tell with all the dirt and decay. That's when they heard it, a rustling in the undergrowth that didn't sound quite like wind or wildlife. The boys froze, suddenly aware of how alone they were in these woods, how far from help. Run, Tommy said. They did. Chapter 2. Questions and Cigarettes. Detective Inspector William Pound lit his third Player's Navy cut of the morning and tried not to think about how his wife would react when she smelled the smoke on his uniform. Again, the war had made everyone's nerves raw as exposed wire, and Mary was no exception. He stood at the edge of Hagley Wood, watching the police surgeon pick his way through the undergrowth toward the wych elm. Dr. James Crawford was a thin man who looked like he'd been stretched on a rack, all angles and edges, with hands that belonged on a concert pianist, rather than someone who spent his days cataloging the various ways human beings could cease to be. Peculiar business this, Constable Harris said, shifting his considerable weight from foot to foot. Tom Harris had been the law in Hagley for near 20 years, and in all that time, the most excitement he'd seen was when the Pemberton boys nicked a bottle of milk from old Mrs. Thorne's doorstep. Peculiar doesn't begin to cover it, Pound muttered, flicking ash onto the damp leaves. The boys, Tommy Willits and his crew, had done the right thing, running straight to Harris after their discovery. Now they huddled near the police car, wrapped in blankets and clutching mugs of sweet tea that someone's mother had provided. They looked smaller than they had any right to, as if the morning's horror had compressed them somehow. Pound had seen plenty of bodies in his time. Birmingham wasn't exactly paradise, especially with the Luftwaffe using it for target practice. But this was different. This was deliberate, personal. Someone had taken the time and effort to stuff a human being into a tree like they were hiding Christmas presents. "Inspector," Crawford's reedy voice carried through the trees. "You'll want to see this." Pound stubbed out his cigarette and made his way to the elm. Up close, the tree looked even more ancient, its bark deeply grooved and pocked with age. The hollow gaped like a mouth frozen in a silent scream. Crawford had laid out a white sheet on the ground and was carefully extracting the remains. Even for a man accustomed to death, he worked with unusual delicacy. "Female," Crawford said without preamble. "Young, I'd say. 20s, perhaps early 30s. Been here at least 18 months, possibly 2 years. Cause of death? Difficult to determine in this state. No obvious trauma to the skull, no broken bones that I can see. But there's this." Crawford held up a piece of fabric with his forceps, taffeta, cream-colored beneath the grime. Stuffed in her mouth could be significant. Pound lit another cigarette. To hell with Mary's complaints. Any identification? Clothing? Jewelry? Fragments of clothing. Appears to be a dress, possibly blue or black. Hard to tell. One shoe, low-heeled. And this. Crawford produced a cheap-looking ring, tarnished but intact. Wedding band, by the look of it. No inscription. A married woman, then. Someone's wife. Someone who'd been missed, surely. Yet Pound couldn't recall any missing persons reports from the area that fit. Not that record-keeping was what it used to be, what with half the country's men overseas and the other half dodging German bombs. "There's something else," Crawford said, his voice dropping. "The position of the body. She wasn't just stuffed in there haphazardly. Someone arranged her, posed her almost. See how the hand extends upward? That's not natural decomposition. That's deliberate." Pound felt the familiar itch between his shoulder blades that meant a case was about to consume his life. He'd felt it before, when they'd found those girls in Bordsley Green, when that munitions worker had turned up in pieces along the canal. But this felt different, older, darker. "Sir?" Constable Harris appeared at his elbow, sweating despite the morning chill. "There's a woman here says she might know something. Local woman. Bit of an odd duck, if you catch my meaning." Pound turned to see a figure in black standing at the police line. She was perhaps 60, rail-thin, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, and they never seemed to blink. "Mrs. Evelyn Cray," Harris whispered, "lives up on Quarry Lane. People say that she knows things." "What sort of things?" Harris shifted uncomfortably. "The sort of things that aren't strictly Christian, if you follow me." Pound didn't follow, not really, but he'd learned long ago that in villages like Hagley, what people believed could be just as important as what was true. He approached the woman, who watched him come with those unblinking eyes. "Mrs. Cray, I'm Detective Inspector Pound. Constable Harris says you might have information." She smiled then, and it was like watching winter crack across a frozen pond. "Information? Oh no, Inspector, but I do know who she is. We all knew she'd turn up eventually. The trees whispered it." Her voice was cultured, at odds with her witchy appearance. "They call her Bella, you know, or they will." "Who calls her Bella?" But Mrs. Cray was already turning away, her black coat swirling around her like wings. "Ask the trees, Inspector. They remember everything, especially the wych elms. Especially that one." She walked away, leaving Pound with the taste of smoke and unease in his mouth. Behind him, Crawford continued his grim work, and the boys huddled closer together, as if proximity could ward off the morning's revelations. Somewhere in the wood, a crow cawed, once, twice, 3 times. An omen, Pound's grandmother would have said. He lit another cigarette and tried not to believe her. Chapter 3. The Butterfly Collector. Professor Marcus Whitmore pinned the painted lady to his collection board with the practiced precision of a man who'd been killing beautiful things for 40 years. His study at 47 Worcester Road, Stourbridge, contained over 3,000 specimens, each one meticulously labeled in his cramped handwriting. But tonight, His hands trembled as he worked. The wireless crackled in the corner. Tommy Handley's nasal voice, delivering yet another ITMA sketch. Usually, Marcus found comfort in the familiar comedy, but tonight the laughter sounded forced, tinny, like something heard through water. He'd read about the discovery in Hagley Wood in the evening edition. A woman's body, found in a tree, been there for years. The pin slipped, pricking his thumb. A bead of blood welled up, dark as elderberry wine. Marcus set down his tools and walked to the window. Outside, the blackout curtains of his neighbors created a wall of darkness, broken only by the occasional slash of light from a carelessly covered window. The AARP wardens would have something to say about that. He thought about Bella. Not her real name, of course. He'd never known her real name. She'd appeared at his door 2 years ago. Was it really only 2 years? It felt like a lifetime, clutching a carpet bag and speaking accented English. Dutch, she'd claimed, though Marcus had spent enough time on the continent to recognize the harder consonants of German bleeding through her careful pronunciation. "I am told you collect things," she'd said, standing on his doorstep like a lost moth drawn to lamplight. Beautiful things. He should have turned her away. A stranger, a foreign woman, appearing at the home of a respectable widower and academic. But there'd been something about her, a quality of stillness, of waiting, that reminded him of the moments before a butterfly emerged from its chrysalis. She'd rented the room above the tobacconist on High Street, paying in advance with crisp pound notes that looked too new. Within a week, she was visiting his study regularly, fascinated by his collection. She'd traced the patterns on their wings with one finger, careful never to touch. "In my country," she'd said once, studying a death's head hawk moth, "we believe butterflies carry souls between worlds." "Superstitious nonsense," Marcus had replied, but gently. Everything he said to her came out gently. She'd smiled that secret smile of hers. "Perhaps, but you keep them here, pinned and labeled. Are you not trying to capture something more than mere insects?" He'd begun to notice things. How she never received letters. How she sometimes slipped and called Thursday Donnerstag. How she'd tense whenever she heard aircraft overhead, counting under her breath until they passed. The night she'd appeared at his door in the rain, her face white with terror, he hadn't asked questions. She'd pressed something into his hand, a roll of papers tied with string, and made him promise to keep them safe. "If something happens," she'd whispered, her accent thickening with fear, "you must get these two." But she'd stopped, shaking her head. "No, better you know nothing. Safer." That was April 1941, the last time he'd seen her. Marcus returned to his desk and unlocked the bottom drawer. The papers were still there, wrapped in oilcloth. He'd looked at them once, just once, and wished he hadn't. Maps, photographs, lists of names and places that meant nothing to him, but clearly meant everything to someone. A knock at the door made him jump. He slammed the drawer shut, heart hammering. "Professor Whitmore?" A woman's voice, but not one he recognized. "My name is Evelyn Cray. I believe we have a mutual acquaintance." He opened the door to find a thin woman in black, her pale eyes seeming to look through him rather than at him. "I'm sorry, I don't." "The Dutch woman," Mrs. Cray interrupted. "Though we both know she wasn't Dutch, don't we?" Marcus's mouth went dry. "I don't know what you mean. She came to you for help. You were kind to her. That kindness may have killed her." Mrs. Cray stepped past him into the hallway without invitation. "The police will be here soon, Professor. They're being very thorough. They'll find your name in her lodgings. She kept a diary, you see. Mentioned the butterfly collector who taught her about transformation." "I didn't. I never." "No, you didn't kill her, but someone did. Someone who knew what she was carrying, what she knew." Mrs. Cray's eyes fixed on his with uncomfortable intensity. "The question is, do you still have what she gave you?" Marcus felt the weight of the papers in his locked drawer like a stone in his chest. Outside, he heard the sound of a car engine, unusual in these days of petrol rationing. "They're here," Mrs. Cray said softly. "You have perhaps 30 seconds to decide, Professor. Will you be the respectable academic who barely knew her? Or will you tell them about the German spy who trusted you with secrets that could hang us all?" The car doors slammed. Footsteps on gravel. Marcus looked at his butterflies, all those captured souls pinned to boards, frozen forever in their moment of perfect beauty. He thought of Bella, for that's how he'd always think of her, no matter her real name, standing in this very room, talking about transformation. I knew her, he said finally. God help me, I knew her. And I know what she was. The knock, when it came, sounded like thunder. Chapter 4. The Hand of Glory. The plow and harrow had stood on the Bromsgrove Road for 300 years, and in all that time, Jack Mossop reckoned, it had never hosted a more peculiar gathering than the one currently occupying his snug. Detective Inspector Pound sat nursing a pint of mild, his notebook spread before him. Across from him, Professor Whitmore clutched a whiskey with hands that hadn't stopped shaking since his interview at the station. And in the corner, like a crow perched on a gravestone, sat Mrs. Evelyn Cray, sipping a port that turned her thin lips the color of blood. "Tell me again about these papers," Pound said, his voice low enough that the handful of other patrons couldn't overhear. "Every detail." Whitmore took a shuddering breath. "I never opened them fully, just glimpsed. There were photographs of the chain home stations, the radar installations along the coast, maps with markings I didn't understand, lists of names. What names? I don't know. British names mostly. Some with addresses in London, Birmingham, Coventry." He paused. There was one that stood out. Vollmer. Klaus Vollmer. It was circled in red. Mrs. Cray made a small sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "The Obwers man in Birmingham, or he was until he disappeared last winter." Pound's eyes sharpened. "And how would you know that, Mrs. Cray?" "Oh, Inspector. In a war, even old women have their uses." She took another sip of port. "I worked in the Foreign Office before I married. One maintains connections." Jack tried not to listen as he polished glasses behind the bar, but the snug was small and voices carried. He'd known there was something off about that foreign woman who'd lodged on High Street. Too pretty, for one thing. Too nervous, for another. The way she jumped whenever anyone spoke to her, unexpected-like. He'd seen her once with a man who wasn't Whitmore. Tall fellow, well-dressed, with the kind of bearing that suggested military service. They'd been arguing in the lane behind the butcher's shop. Jack had been taking out the rubbish and heard raised voices. The man had grabbed her arm, and she'd pulled away, spitting what sounded like German curses. "There's more," Whitmore was saying. "The night she came to me, she was terrified. Said they knew what she'd done, that they'd kill her for it. They being her German handlers? I assumed so. But now—" Whitmore glanced at Mrs. Cray. "I'm not certain of anything." Mrs. Cray set down her glass with deliberate care. "Have you ever heard of a Hand of Glory, Inspector?" Pound frowned. "Some sort of folk magic nonsense?" "The preserved hand of a hanged man, used in certain practices. But I speak metaphorically. In intelligence work, a Hand of Glory is an asset who serves multiple masters, often without knowing it. Someone who believes they're working for one side while actually serving another. You're saying she was a double agent?" "I'm saying, Inspector, that nothing in this war is as simple as it appears. The woman you found in that tree, Bella, as she'll come to be known, was caught in currents far stronger than she understood." Jack dropped a glass. It shattered on the stone floor with a sound like breaking bells. "Sorry," he muttered, fetching the dustpan. "Butterfingers." But his hands were steady as he swept up the shards. He was thinking of another night, 2 years past. The woman, Bella, standing in his pub garden after closing time, tears streaming down her face. He'd gone out for a smoke and found her there, clutching a small valise. "Please," she'd said in that accented voice, "I need somewhere to hide this, just for tonight. They cannot find it." He'd been 3 sheets to the wind, full of Dutch courage and wartime bravado. The valise had gone into his cellar, behind the pre-war bottles he was saving for when the boys came home. She'd promised to return for it the next night. She never had. "The real question," Mrs. Cray was saying, "is not who killed her, but why stuff her in that particular tree. The wych elm has significance in certain circles." "What kind of significance?" Pound asked, though he looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Wych elms were once used for hanging. The wood was thought to trap the souls of the condemned, preventing them from seeking vengeance. If someone wanted to ensure a secret stayed buried, literally and figuratively, a wych elm would be the perfect choice." "Superstitious rubbish," Pound muttered, but Jack noticed he'd gone pale. "Perhaps, or perhaps someone believed it enough to act on it. Fear and belief are powerful motivators, Inspector, especially when combined with guilt. The pub door opened, bringing a gust of cold air and the smell of rain. A young man entered, RAF uniform, pilot's wings, the 1,000-yard stare that said he'd seen too much sky and death. He ordered a whiskey at the bar, his hands trembling slightly. "You were here that night," he said quietly to Jack. "When she died." Jack's blood turned to ice water. "I don't know what you mean." "I flew over Hagley Wood, saw the lights, 3 cars, maybe 4. They had her." The pilot knocked back his whiskey in one go. "I reported it, but my CO said to forget what I'd seen, said it was being handled, but they didn't handle it, did they? They just buried it. Buried her." He set down his glass and walked to the snug where the 3 investigators sat frozen. "Flying Officer Peter Hallwell," he said, saluting sloppily. "I know who killed your Bella, but if I tell you, we'll all be dead by morning." Outside, thunder rolled across the Midlands sky. Jack thought of the valise in his cellar, of secrets buried and unburied, of the way war turned everyone into strangers, even to themselves, especially to themselves. Chapter 5. The Night Hunters. Flying Officer Peter Hallwell's hands shook as he lit his 3rd cigarette in as many minutes. The back room of the Plow and Harrow had gone cold, despite the fire Jack Mossop had built up in the grate. Some chills, Pound was learning, came from inside. "Start from the beginning," Pound said, his policeman's notebook at the ready. "What were you doing over Hagley Wood that night?" "Returning from a training run, Bristol and back, midnight, maybe 1:45. Hallwell's eyes had that peculiar glaze of a man seeing something other than what was in front of him. "I was running low on fuel, should have headed straight back to base, but I saw the lights." "What lights? There's a blackout on." "That's just it. 4 cars, parked in a clearing near that old elm, full headlamps blazing, in the middle of a bloody air raid blackout." He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I thought it was 5th columnists at first, signaling to German bombers, so I circled back for another look." Mrs. Cray leaned forward, her pale eyes reflecting the firelight. "What did you see, Flying Officer?" "They had her between 2 cars, 3 men, maybe 4. She was struggling, fighting. Christ, she was fighting hard." He crushed out his cigarette with unnecessary force. "One of them hit her. She went down. That's when I saw who it was." "Who?" Pound asked, though something in his stomach already knew this was bigger than a simple murder. "Wing Commander Reginald Thornley, my CO's superior. I'd know that bald head anywhere, shaped like a bloody egg." Hallwell's laugh had no humor in it. "There was another man I recognized, civilian, sometimes came to the base for consultations. Never knew his name, but he had this way of looking at you like he was measuring you for a coffin." Professor Whitmore made a small sound. "Thin man, dark hair, gray at the temples, always wore a signet ring on his right hand." "That's him. You know him?" "He visited Bella once, at my house. She went white as a sheet when she saw him through the window, hid in my study until he left." Pound felt the case shifting beneath him like quicksand. Military intelligence, murder, cover-ups. This was miles above his pay grade. What happened next? "I couldn't exactly land and intervene, could I? By the time I got back to base and tried to report it, Thornley was already there, told me I'd seen nothing, that if I valued my wings and my neck, I'd forget the whole thing." Hallwell's hands clenched, but I couldn't forget her face in those headlights, the way she looked up at the sky like she was hoping for rescue. "Why kill her there?" Pound asked. "Why not? Dispose of her more efficiently." It was Mrs. Cray who answered. "Because they weren't just killing a spy, Inspector. They were performing a ritual." "Oh, come off it." "No, listen." Her voice had taken on an urgent quality. "The wych elm, the positioning of the body, the cloth in her mouth, these aren't random choices. Someone wanted to ensure not just her death, but her silence, permanent silence." Jack Mossop cleared his throat. There's something else. That valise she left with me. I looked inside. God help me. I looked." All eyes turned to him. There were papers. Yes, but also photographs, not military installations. He swallowed hard. That ritual sites, stone circles, ancient trees, and people, important people, dressed in robes, performing ceremonies. "What kind of ceremonies?" Pound asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. "The kind that powerful men don't want documented," Mrs. Cray said softly. "The kind that have been performed in these islands since before the Romans came. the kind that require sacrifices. You're saying she was killed by some sort of occult group? I'm saying, Inspector, that in wartime, all manner of allegiances are formed. Some men turn to Hitler, others turn to older powers, and sometimes those who stumble upon such secrets must be silenced in very specific ways. Hallwell stood abruptly. I've said too much, they'll know. They always know. He looked around the room wildly. Don't you see? They're probably watching right now, listening. They have eyes everywhere. As if summoned by his words, the pub's front door burst open. 3 men in dark suits entered, their faces bland and forgettable in that way that suggested practice. The tallest one, thin with graying temples, smiled without warmth. Flying Officer Hallwell, you've missed curfew. We've come to escort you back to base. Pound stood. I'm Detective Inspector Pound. This man is assisting with a murder investigation. The thin man's smile never wavered. I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Inspector. There is no murder investigation. The remains found in Hagley Wood have been identified as a vagrant who died of natural causes. Case closed. Like hell. Furthermore, the man continued as if Pound hadn't spoken, any suggestion otherwise would be considered harmful to the war, spreading panic, undermining morale. I trust I don't need to explain what happens to those who undermine morale during wartime. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Jack noticed the other 2 men had positioned themselves by the exits. Professional. Practiced. Professor Whitmore, the thin man said, turning those cold eyes on the academic. Your expertise is needed at the War Office. Immediately. Something about butterfly migration patterns and weather prediction. It wasn't a request. And Mrs. Cray, the smile widened. How nice to see you again. It's been, 15 years? You haven't aged a day. For the first time since Pound had met her, Evelyn Cray looked afraid. Gentlemen, she said, standing with careful dignity, I believe we all understand the situation. Perhaps it would be best if we cooperated. Cooperated? Pound exploded. A woman is dead. Many women are dead, Inspector, the thin man said. It's a war, and if you'd like to ensure no more join them, you'll return to Birmingham and forget this ever happened. Thunder crashed overhead, and the lights flickered. In that moment of darkness, Pound could have sworn he saw something else in the thin man's eyes, something old and hungry and not entirely human. When the lights came back, Flying Officer Hallwell was gone. The front door swung on its hinges, rain driving in. He was just here, Jack whispered. He was just bloody here. The thin man adjusted his cuffs. Was he? I don't recall seeing anyone. Do you, Inspector? Pound's mouth worked soundlessly, because the terrible thing was, he couldn't quite remember. Hallwell's face was already fading, like a dream upon waking. The car is waiting, the thin man said. All of you. Now. As they filed out into the storm, Pound caught a glimpse of graffiti on the pub wall, fresh paint still dripping in the rain. Ho put Bella down the Wych Elm. But when he blinked, it was gone. Chapter 6. The Hollow Men. The car moved through the night like a black beetle, its headlights cutting yellow wounds in the darkness. Pound sat wedged between Whitmore and Mrs. Cray in the back seat, while Jack Mossop faced them on a jump seat, his publican's face pale as curdled milk. The thin man sat up front with the driver, occasionally turning to smile at them with teeth that seemed too numerous for his mouth. Where are you taking us? Pound demanded for the 3rd time. Somewhere safe, the thin man replied, same as before. Somewhere we can discuss things properly. They'd left Birmingham behind, heading north through the scarred countryside. Bomb craters pocked the fields like acne, and more than once they passed the skeleton of a burned-out farmhouse. The war had touched everything, Pound thought, even the land itself. I knew your predecessor, Mrs. Cray said suddenly, her voice cutting through the engine's drone. Inspector Morrison. He investigated a similar case in 1928, a girl found in a mine shaft, arranged just so. He got too close to the truth. What happened to him? Pound asked, though he suspected he knew. Suicide, they said. Found hanging from a wych elm near his home. Left a note confessing to the murder. She laughed, a sound like winter wind. Curious how the guilty always seem to find wych elms when it's time to die. The thin man's smile widened. Ancient times, Mrs. Cray, were much more civilized now. The car turned onto a narrow lane, branches scraping against the windows like fingernails. Ahead, Pound could see lights, an old manor house, 3 stories of weathered stone and watching windows. As they pulled into the circular drive, he noticed other cars already, military vehicles, government plates. "Welcome to Cradleford House," the thin man said. "Do try to keep an open mind." Inside, the house smelled of wood polish and something else, something organic and unpleasant, like flowers left too long in water. The thin man led them through corridors lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to track their movement. Pound heard voices from somewhere deeper in the house, chanting perhaps, though he couldn't make out the words. They were ushered into a library where a fire crackled in the hearth. Several men waited for them, military brass, government types, and one Pound recognized with a shock as the chief constable of Worcestershire. "Ah, Inspector Pound," the chief constable said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Bit of a sticky wicket this, but I'm sure we can sort things out." "Sir, with respect, what the hell is going on?" "Sit," the thin man commanded, and somehow Pound found himself obeying. "Let me tell you a story, Inspector, about a young woman who thought she could play all sides, who collected secrets like your professor here collects butterflies. Her name was Clara Bowerla," a new voice said. Wing Commander Thornley stepped from the shadows, his egg-shaped head gleaming in the firelight. "German national, recruited by the Abwehr in 1939, sent here to gather intelligence on our radar installations." "But she was more than that," the thin man continued. "She was a mystic, a believer in old powers. She thought she could use what she learned here, not just our military secrets, but our other practices, to aid the German cause." "What practices?" Pound asked, though his skin was already crawling. "Britain is an old country, Inspector," the chief constable said. "Old countries have old traditions. Some of us understand that in times of war, all weapons must be considered, even those our Christian faith might frown upon." "You're talking about magic," Whitmore whispered. "Actual magic." "We prefer to call it alternative intelligence gathering," Thornley said. "The Germans have their Ahnenerbe, seeking occult weapons. We have our own resources." Mrs. Cray laughed again, that winter sound. "Resources. Is that what you call it when you murder young women under ancient trees?" "She was a spy," the thin man said sharply. She'd infiltrated our circle, learned things that could have given the Germans advantages we couldn't allow. Her death was necessary." "And the ritual elements?" Pound pressed. "The positioning, the cloth in her mouth?" "Insurance," Thornley admitted. "Old beliefs say a witch's spirit can be bound to prevent her from revealing secrets even after death. We couldn't take chances." "This is insane," Jack burst out. "You're all bloody insane." The thin man moved so fast Pound barely saw it. One moment he was by the fire, the next he had Jack by the throat, lifting the sturdy publican off his feet with impossible strength. "Sanity is a luxury we can't afford in wartime," he hissed, and his face changed, features shifting like wax under heat, revealing something underneath that made Pound's mind gibber. "Put him down," Mrs. Cray commanded, and her voice carried an authority that made the windows rattle. "Or shall I speak certain names? Shall I tell them what you really are, Mr. Hollow?" The thin man, Mr. Hollow, dropped Jack and turned to her, his face reassembling itself. "You always were too clever, Evelyn. It's what saved you in 28. But times change." "Some things don't," she replied. "The old contracts still hold. You can't harm us without cause." "Can't we?" Thornley pulled out his service revolver. "We're at war. Enemy agents, saboteurs, tragic casualties happen all the time." That's when the lights went out. In the darkness, Pound heard impossible things. Wings beating, voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. Something wet and heavy slithering across the floor. When the lights returned, they were no longer in the library. They stood in a stone chamber far underground, surrounded by robed figures. The walls were carved with symbols that hurt to look at, and in the center of the room grew a tree. A wych elm, ancient beyond measure, its roots cracking through the stone floor, its branches spreading across the ceiling like neural pathways, and in its trunk a hollow that gaped like a mouth. "Welcome to the true Cradleford House," Mr. Hollow said, his too-wide smile reflecting the torchlight. "Where we feed the old gods to keep Britain safe, where necessary sacrifices are made." "You're going to kill us," Pound said. It wasn't a question. "Oh no, Inspector, we're going to give you a choice." Mr. Hollow gestured to the tree. "Join us and help feed the hunger that keeps our enemies at bay, or feed it yourselves." The robed figures began to chant, and the tree responded. Its branches moved without wind, reaching toward them like desperate hands. In its hollow, something stirred, something that might once have been human, but was now part of the wood itself, face pressed against the inner bark, mouth open in an eternal scream. "Clara," Whitmore whispered. "Oh God, that's Clara. She's still alive." "After a fashion," Mr. Hollow agreed. "The tree preserves what it takes. She'll whisper our enemies' secrets for centuries to come. Unless, of course, we feed it fresh voices." The chanting grew louder. The tree's branches reached closer. And somewhere in the distance, Pound could swear he heard air raid sirens, though he couldn't tell if they were warning of German bombers or something far worse descending upon them all. Chapter 7. The Names of the Dead. Mrs. Evelyn Cray stood straighter than Pound had ever seen her, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "I name you," she said, pointing at Mr. Hollow. "I name you Gwynep Nud, the Hollow King, he who rides between. I name you by the Compact of 1347, by the blood of Thomas de Cradleford, by the 7 seals of Somerset." The effect was immediate. Mr. Hollow, the thing wearing a man's face, recoiled as if struck. The chanting faltered. Several of the robed figures stepped back. "You dare. I dare because I must." Mrs. Cray pulled something from her coat, a leather journal, cracked with age. "Inspector Morrison gave this to me before he died, the true record of 1928. The names of all who fed the tree that year, including," she smiled coldly, "Wing Commander Thornley's father." Thornley's face went the color of old bone. "That's not possible. My father died in the trenches." "Your father died in this chamber, feeding a daughter of the village to that abomination." She opened the journal, and Pound glimpsed pages covered in cramped handwriting and dark stains. "Would you like me to read his confession? How he believed it would bring victory in the Great War? How the tree whispered promises of glory?" The tree shuddered, its branches writhing more violently. In its hollow, Clara Bowerl's trapped form moved, her mouth shaping words none of them could hear. "The compact must be maintained," Mr. Hollow hissed, but uncertainty flickered in those inhuman eyes. "The protection of the realm." "Built on murder and lies," Jack Mossop said, finding his voice. The publican's face was red with fury. "How many girls have you fed to that thing? How many enemy agents who were just in the wrong place?" 37, Whitmore said quietly. Everyone turned to stare at him. "I've been thinking about it. The butterflies. 37 species have gone locally extinct since 1900, each time matching a disappearance." His laugh had a hysterical edge. "I thought it was industrialization, pollution, but it was you. Every time you feed that tree, something beautiful dies forever." "Professor," Mr. Hollow's voice turned silky, dangerous. "You of all people should understand sacrifice. Your wife. Don't." Whitmore's hands clenched. "Don't you dare." "She was ill, suffering. You prayed for release, didn't you? And when she finally passed, so peacefully, you never questioned the timing. Never wondered why Dr. Crawford was so certain it was natural causes." The implications hung in the air like poison gas. Pound watched the professor crumble, understanding dawning on his face. You used her, fed her to that thing." "Fed her suffering," Mr. Hollow corrected. "The tree doesn't always require death. Sometimes pain is enough, sometimes despair. Your wife's final months provided quite a feast." That's when Whitmore snapped. With a cry of rage, he lunged not at Mr. Hollow, but at the tree itself, pulling a lighter from his pocket, the silver one his wife had given him their last Christmas together. Before anyone could stop him, he'd set fire to the journal Mrs. Cray had dropped in surprise. "If it feeds on records, on memory," he shouted, throwing the burning book at the elm's base, "then let's starve it." The tree screamed, not with any human voice, but with the sound of wood splitting, of sap boiling, of roots tearing through stone. The robed figures cried out, some fleeing, others rushing forward to beat at the flames. But the fire spread with unnatural speed, racing up the ancient bark. "You fool!" Mr. Hollow's human masks slipped entirely, revealing something that Pound's mind refused to process. Angles that shouldn't exist, spaces between spaces, a hollow that went down forever. "Do you know what you've done?" "I've set her free," Whitmore said, tears streaming down his face. In the tree's hollow, Clara Bowerly's form began to separate from the wood. Not cleanly, strings of bark and heartwood clung to her, pulled at her, tried to drag her back. but she fought with strength born of 2 years' torment, clawing her way toward freedom. The chamber shook. Stones fell from the ceiling. The other wych elms, for Pound realized now that the walls were lined with them, each presumably containing its own prisoner, began to writhe and keen. "Run," Mrs. Cray commanded, grabbing Pound's arm. "The compact is breaking." They fled through corridors that hadn't been there before, up stairs that spiraled in directions geometry shouldn't allow. Behind them, the screaming grew louder, not just the trees now, but the voices of all those fed to them over centuries. The house itself was coming apart, reality unraveling at the seams. They burst out onto the grounds to find the manor in flames. Not ordinary fire, this burned cold and blue, leaving frost in its wake. In the sky above, shapes moved that weren't clouds, weren't planes, weren't anything that belonged in a sane world. "The car!" Jack pointed to their vehicle, still parked in the drive. The driver was gone, fled or consumed. Pound didn't want to know. They piled in, Jack taking the wheel, and tore off down the lane as Cradleford House collapsed behind them. In the rearview mirror, Pound saw Mr. Hollow standing in the ruins, no longer bothering with human shape, an absence in the world that hurt to perceive. But worse was what stood beside him. Clara Bowerlow, free of the tree but not unchanged, wood and flesh fused, neither alive nor dead, raising one transformed hand to wave goodbye, or perhaps to curse them. "Where do we go?" Jack asked, his voice shaking. "Where is safe?" "Nowhere," Mrs. Cray said grimly. "But we go to ground, separate, hide. Hope they're too busy containing what we've unleashed to hunt us immediately." "What have we unleashed?" Pound asked. "The hungry dead, centuries of sacrifices, no longer bound. They'll seek their killers first, but when those are gone..." She shuddered. Britain's protection has become its curse. As they reached the main road, Pound saw other cars fleeing, government plates, military vehicles, all racing away from what they'd created and could no longer control. In the distance, air raid sirens wailed, but he knew they weren't warning of German bombs. "Will she come for us?" Whitmore asked quietly. "Clara?" Mrs. Cray was silent for a long moment. Then she whispered something as we fled. I read her lips. "What?" "Thank you." She paused. "And I'm sorry for what comes next." They drove through the night, 4 strangers bound by horror, while behind them the sky burned with cold fire and things that had been safely buried for centuries began to claw their way back into the world. In his pocket, Pound's notebook felt heavy as stone. Evidence of something impossible. A story no one would believe. But they would believe the graffiti that began appearing on walls across Britain, painted by hands that were no longer entirely human. "Who put Bella down the wych elm? Who put Bella down the wych elm? Who put Bella down the wych elm?" The question that would echo through the decades, unanswered, because the truth was worse than any lie. Chapter 8. Who Put Bella Down the Wych Elm? 6 months later, the boarding house in Blackpool smelled of kippers and defeat. Pound, no longer inspector, that life burned away with Cradleford House, sat by the window watching the gray Irish Sea merge with the gray October sky. His beard had grown wild. His papers claimed he was Thomas Pound, invalided out of the Merchant Navy. No one asked questions in Blackpool. Too many people here were running from something. The newspapers told lies, of course. Gas leak at Cradleford House, tragic loss of life. German spy ring uncovered and eliminated, medals posthumously awarded. The truth was harder to hide. The suicides among the surviving cult members, the things found wandering the countryside that weren't quite human anymore, the trees across Britain that had begun to bleed. But the war ground on, and people had bigger worries than folklore come to life. A knock at his door made him reach for the revolver he kept under his pillow. "Who is it?" "Someone who remembers." He recognized Mrs. Cray's voice and cautiously opened the door. She looked older, frailer, but her eyes still held that unsettling clarity. She wasn't alone. Jack Mossop stood behind her, thinner than before, his publican's joviality replaced by the haunted look of a man who'd seen too much. "You shouldn't have come," Pound said, "but let them in anyway." "Had to." Jack said, "It's Whitmore and her." They told him the story in pieces. How Whitmore had returned to Hagley despite their agreement to stay apart. How he'd been found in his study, surrounded by butterflies, all of them free from their pins, their wings forming messages on the walls. Messages in German, in English, in languages that predated both. "She's calling us back," Mrs. Cray said. "Clara." Bella, whatever she is now. Why? To finish what we started. She pulled out a new journal, this one filled with her own careful handwriting. I've been researching. The trees, the sacrifices, the compact. It's older than Britain itself, older than humanity. We didn't break it, we just interrupted it. So? So it's healing, adapting. The cult is reforming under new leadership. Her smile was bitter. Turns out Mr. Hollow was just middle management. The real powers are stirring, and they want their trees fed. Let someone else fight them, Pound said. We've done enough. Have we? Jack asked. Tommy Willits, the boy who found her, hanged himself last week. Left a note. She won't stop whispering. The other boys are having nightmares, drawing things. Bob Farmer tried to burn down a wych elm in his garden, nearly took the whole street with it. Pound closed his eyes. He'd tried so hard to forget those boys, to pretend their part in this was over. What does she want? Justice, Mrs. Cray said simply. Or revenge. At this point, I'm not sure there's a difference. That night, they drove back to Hagley Wood. Pound didn't ask how Mrs. Cray had obtained petrol coupons or why no patrols stopped them. Some questions were better left unasked. The wood was different now. The trees grew too close together, their branches forming patterns that suggested script in dead languages. The path to the wych elm was lined with fresh graffiti, all asking the same question in a dozen hands. The elm itself had changed most of all. Larger, more twisted, its hollow gaping wider than should be possible. And standing before it, patient as winter, was Clara Bowerla. She was beautiful and terrible. Wood and flesh had found a new harmony, bark skin that caught the moonlight, hair of leaves that rustled with each breath, eyes that held the depth of heartwood and the fury of the betrayed. You came, she said, her voice the sound of wind through branches. Good, I have something to show you. She gestured to the elm's hollow. Inside, Pound saw not darkness but a window, a view of another chamber, another tree. Mr. Hollow stood there with new robed figures preparing a new sacrifice. A young woman, bound and gagged, terror in her eyes. Every wych elm in Britain is connected now, Clara explained. What I learned in the tree, what all of us learned, we're the network, the deleted files, the burned evidence. She smiled, and bark cracked along her cheeks. They made us part of their weapon. Now we choose how it's aimed. What do you want from us? Pound asked. Witnesses, she said. Someone must record the truth. Not their lies, but what really happened. Who we were before they made us into nightmares. She looked at Mrs. Cray. You know the old ways. Make it binding. Make it last. Mrs. Cray nodded slowly. The three of us will tell the story. Keep telling it. Make sure someone always asks the question. Why that question? Jack asked. Why who put Bella down the wych elm? Clara's laugh was autumn leaves skittering across stone. Because names have power. They called me Bella to strip away my identity, make me nobody, a thing to be disposed of. But every time someone writes those words, asks that question, they give me back my power, and I use it. In the hollow, the scene shifted. The new sacrifice twisted free of her bonds, Clara's influence, Pound realized. The robed figures fell back in alarm as their victims stood, no longer helpless. I'll stop them when I can, Clara said. Save who I can, but I need you to remember. To make others remember. That's your punishment and your purpose. For how long? Pound asked. Until the last wych elm falls. Until the last secret is told. Until justice and revenge are indistinguishable from memory. She stepped back into the hollow, merging with the tree once more. But this time, Pound sensed, by choice, a guardian now, rather than a prisoner. They left the wood in silence, but by morning the graffiti had spread. Not just in Hagley, but across Britain. On bomb-damaged walls, on church stones, on the shells of burned-out buildings. Ho put Bella down the wych elm. They spent the rest of their lives telling the story, carefully, quietly, to those who would listen. Jack in his new pub in Wales, Mrs. Cray in her letters to researchers and historians, Pound in the reports he filed in dusty archives, knowing they'd be found someday. When Pound died in 1961, his last words were, "She's still asking." When Jack passed in 1973, the graffiti appeared on his gravestone overnight. When Mrs. Cray vanished in 1981, she left only a note, "My turn to feed the tree, but I go willingly." And still the question echoes, in Hagley Wood, where tourists come to see the famous elm. In Birmingham, where urban explorers find it in abandoned tunnels. In London, where it appears whenever another girl goes missing. Who put Bella down the Wych Elm? The answer changes. A spurned lover, a Nazi spy ring, a witch's coven. But the truth remains constant. Power feeds on the innocent. Secrets grow in darkness, and sometimes the dead refuse to stay silent. In the Hagley Wood, the Wych Elm still stands. Older, stranger, hollow as a scream. And on foggy nights, locals say you can see her standing guard. Part tree, part woman, all vengeance. Waiting for the next fool who thinks human lives can be currency for power. She saves who she can. The rest she remembers. And through it all, the question persists, painted by hands living and dead. Who put Bella down the Wych Elm? Now you know. Now you must remember. Now you must ask.